Welcome to Behavior and Risk, where we explore the intersection of decisions, the brain, uncertainty, and the business world. I'm John Burkhart.
And I'm Rich Loria.
We're glad you took a chance on us today. Hannibal Lecter, Patrick Bateman, Amy Dunn, Anton Chigurh, the Joker. Popular media is full of depictions of characters that one might describe as sociopaths. It's a viscerally compelling trope. In many ways, sociopaths are unknowable to neurotypical individuals. They subvert all normal human behavioral expectations. They can undertake actions that we would find repulsive or even impossible. We're terrified by their alienness, but simultaneously fascinated by their total freedom from societal constraints. In clinical usage, sociopathy isn't a real diagnosis. Sociopathy and psychopathy both fall under the umbrella of something called Antisocial Personality Disorder. There are some inconsistencies in usage and meaning of sociopathy and psychopathy across different eras, time periods, and even between the United States and the United Kingdom. But whatever specific term is used, there is a commonly understood conceptualization for such individuals that we all generally share. Shallow emotional responses, lack of empathy, lack of remorse, and an inability to relate to others as people. This last element sometimes internalizes, resulting in an inability to relate to themselves and their own emotions, resulting in disinhibited behavior, impulsivity, and egocentrism. So, why are we talking about this? Behavior and Risk is not a clinical podcast. We focus primarily on the risk and business world. Well, we bring this up for two reasons. First, sociopaths are far more common than most people realize. The National Institute of Mental Health estimates that between 1% and 4% of adults meet the clinical criteria for antisocial personality disorder, and other agencies place it as high as 6%. And all of these almost certainly underreport the true prevalence, as these include only those individuals who have been properly diagnosed. When we consider undiagnosed individuals, it's really not unreasonable that as many as 1 in 10 adults could exhibit some form of antisocial personality disorder. Second, we bring this up because a lot of common assumptions about sociopaths are wrong, or at best incomplete. Most, the overwhelming majority even, are not serial killers and megalomaniacs. Most can be described as successful or organized sociopaths. And as it turns out, this can make for a very particular shape of high-functioning individual. Most learn how to mask their antisocial traits at a young age in order to better function in society, and this masking tends to make such individuals quite charming, and by extension, teaches them how to identify and manipulate emotions in other people. The flat affect that many feel makes such individuals resistant or even immune to stress. Reduced impulse control allows them to swing for the fences on risky or uncertain opportunities without a second thought. And their lack of empathy means that what we think of as hard choices aren't hard for these people at all. It doesn't take much explaining to see how this collection of traits can readily fast-track someone to senior leadership within an organization. And while it's impossible to know for certain just how many sociopaths sit in executive roles, on pure percentages, it's a certainty that there's more than a handful. What we want to examine in this episode is, what do such individuals look like? What does their presence and their decisions do to the operations and subsequently to the risk exposure of a company? And what should we as risk managers be watching for in order to ensure the smooth functioning of our organizations? And Rich, I know that you have a number of topics in mind and a number of questions you want to explore around this, but I do feel it's important to put one thing on the table first, and that is that the first thing that we should do is not try to diagnose people. Purely from a risk management standpoint, this is a bad idea. Antisocial personality disorder is a recognized DSM disorder, which means that in most cases, it falls under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Going around and trying to assess an employee's medical pathology is a fantastic way to get yourself fired and to create all manner of trouble for your organization. So, with that caveat off the board, where do we go? What do we look at, and how do we start exploring this space where we know such individuals are around us, very likely in leadership roles, How do we navigate that?
So, John, that was an excellent introduction and a very comprehensive one, hitting upon all of the things that, or certainly a number of the key traits of sociopaths, and getting it a bit into why they are frequently part of senior management teams at reputable organizations. As you've pointed out, John, in most cases, they're not serial killers or megalomaniacs, but are actually well-functioning people that have an underlying, what I like to think of as a dark side, a Machiavellian side, that the ends justify certain types of means, and those means may not necessarily fit social norms or have any particular regard for human values. Where this topic actually landed on our plates, I just want to be very clear, is first off, to your point, John, I certainly don't feel that I'm qualified to identify a sociopath in any way, shape, or form. And I would not recommend to anybody in our audience, particularly if you don't have a medical background, to go and try to do that yourself.
I will
What
echo that and amplify that. We are not clinicians. I have a bit of exposure to the research neuroscience space. That is research neuroscience. That is not clinical neuroscience. So we are exploring a topic. We are not providing diagnostic criteria in any capacity.
So because of that, and because this does lead to a more different discussion that I think our listeners are going to hear relative to our previous episodes, and probably most other episodes that you'll listen to in this series, frankly, I'm somewhat uncomfortable talking about this. However, I feel compelled to talk about this for two reasons. One, I have witnessed what I would categorize as sociopathic behavior throughout my career at different stages and with different folks. Certainly, I'm not going to name names, and I'll certainly do my best to keep things as anonymous as possible from my experience. Secondly, and this is really the one that I think put me over the top in terms of, yeah, we need to do a podcast about this, is that in recent sessions of the cognitive bias and ERM course that you and I have designed and that we're continuing to teach at Columbia, students have approached me at different points in the class and said, well, how do you take some of these teachings and apply it to folks who have these types of characteristics that could be categorized as a sociopathic or something similar? And it's a difficult answer for me. It is certainly, it puts me in somewhat of an uncomfortable place because I think many of the techniques and so forth are designed for folks who don't have those traits or certainly have those traits in a far less degree. So I feel like in order to serve those who are really interested in exploring this space in a more meaningful way, I do feel we owe it to our audience and to those who are trying to apply these techniques in organizations, whether we're talking about techniques for mitigating availability bias or mental accounting or intertemporal discounting, that we need to address ways of being able to deal with certain types of individuals who may have more of these sociopathic characteristics that you've highlighted.
You make an interesting point about how our frameworks and our really the entire content of the course that we've put together does not factor for such individuals. And in broad strokes, this is true across the board for most behavioral economics and behavioral science literature. What we talk about when we say people perform X or people make judgments in this particular capacity, we are speaking about mean or median responses. We are speaking about averages or prototypical individuals within a population. By virtually every definition, individuals with sociopathy, with antisocial personality disorder, clearly fall within the bucket that could be termed neurodivergent. They are not neurotypical individuals. But when we look at that prevalence, when we say that the low end is 1%, high end as much as 10%, even 1% as a function of population is pretty prevalent. And the fact that it has not been selected out to a much lower percentage across generations suggests to me that this is not a disorder in the classic medical sense. And I know that that's a loaded term in today's parlance, but this is not a maladaptive trait. This is an alternate functioning mode. This is something that is selected for in small populations because it has certain advantages that allow these individuals to perform certain things better than other individuals. And I think that we are seeing that or we speculate that we are seeing that in many of the people we see in leadership positions in organizations today. I've emphasized that I say we speculate that we are seeing that because without proper diagnoses, we don't know who is sociopathic and who is not. And this comes to the point you raised previously that you have seen individuals who manifest these particular traits. I have as well. And listeners, Rich and I were talking before we began recording. We don't say this lightly. We recognize that there is a differentiation between clinical antisocial personality disorder and people who display certain levels of sociopathic traits. And it's also really important to recognize that just because somebody is ambitious and or ruthless does not automatically mean that they are sociopaths. I can think of somebody in particular who I've collaborated with for some time who is quite ruthless in his business dealings, but by no means would I consider him a sociopath. Having said that, yes, I have seen individuals who I have suspicions who, if you were to put a gun to my head and say, who's the sociopath in the room, I would probably point them out. And they are maybe not ubiquitous, but a feature of leadership positions in the commercial space.
So here's a first question I have for you in relation to that, John. Is sociopathy or ASPD, is it all or nothing? Or is it more nuanced than that? Is there more of a continuum? You and I have been talking about this for a while now. Could you address that for our listeners just to tee that up?
Absolutely. It is not a binary. It is not that you are a sociopath or you are not a sociopath. Look at those numbers we mentioned early on, where there's 1 to 4% of the population could be characterized as having antisocial personality disorder. Well, if these are diagnosed individuals, then how can we have a range that large? We have a range that large because it's not always clear, because there is a continuum. And because, well, for a number of reasons, there are separate traits that exist within this spectrum of antisocial personality disorder. And typically, when doing a clinical assessment, one looks at how strongly they score on each of these dimensions. And if they rise over a certain threshold, then they are classified as having antisocial personality disorder. Well, what if somebody is just under that threshold? Or what if somebody is way over on one particular dimension, but under on other dimensions? Now we have much more unclear cases. These are edge and corner cases where it's not really clear. And to your point, it's not something where we can say, this person's a sociopath, they have these traits. It is a spectrum. This is why we do see such separation between what we call organized and disorganized sociopaths, those who are capable of functioning within society and those who really have no ability. Those extreme cases where people are off the scale on every dimension have a great deal of difficulty having any sort of normal function within human society. So yes, there is a continuum, and this means that really the conversation should probably be more around sociopathic traits rather than labels and diagnoses of sociopathy. And anybody can have various levels of these sociopathic traits. There's, depending on how much validity you attribute to it, there's something called the dark triad of psychology, and these are constellations of maladaptive personality traits that allow people to be manipulative or exploitative without remorse or conscience. The validity of the dark triad is questionable depending on who you speak to, but yes, you do see different levels of different traits. I feel as though I've rambled a bit there, but does that speak to the question you put forward?
Absolutely. And it aligns with a lot of what I've observed in that different individuals I've come across in my career have shown different levels of sociopathy or some of these traits, being strong in certain traits and less so in others. One other thing I just want to make clear for a lot of our listeners is that, in my humble opinion, and John, I'm happy to have a debate with you if you disagree, one cannot always look at specific actions as a de facto indicator of sociopathic behavior, particularly in the business world where, frankly, sometimes very difficult decisions that adversely impact many human lives can occur. In my experience, I have on more than one occasion seen business leaders have to make very hard decisions about who remains employed and who does not, particularly in a dysfunctional or a money losing business. Let's cut to the chase. If a business continues to hemorrhage money, that is not sustainable. And sometimes the only choice you have, sometimes things get to such a state that the only logical choice is to discontinue the business operations. And that has very difficult consequences that come with it.
I'm not going to debate you on that because I agree with everything that you just put forward. I'm not sure if you remember this. I would suspect that you do because of the way you teed this up. But listeners, the entire reason we started exploring sociopathy as a topic was because a conversation we had with our research team where Rich and I were explaining how malicious outcomes do not always imply malicious intent, where somebody can be sufficiently removed from a decision and not fully be aware of the outcomes that they are creating when they make a decision. It does not automatically mean that they are malevolent or sociopathic or completely detached from any empathy with those who they impact. So, yes, I agree with that. I think this also goes to the core of risk appetite and even more foundationally, choice architecture, something that we've discussed amongst ourselves for years now, which is that you can have different balances of factors that produce the same outcome, that produce the same phenotype. With risk appetite, we know that different balances of perception and preference can lead to the identical observed risk appetite. And with choice architecture, we know that different aggregations of behavioral forces can produce the same decisions and judgments. And that's every bit as applicable here. Just because somebody has made a decision that is perhaps questionable or perhaps appears too risky or has negative impact on rank and file employees down the line does not mean that the person making that decision was sociopathic in their tendencies. And even more foundationally, or perhaps even more abstractly, just because something goes wrong doesn't mean the decision was bad. Every risk decision is a probabilistic decision. We teach this in the class. Every time you make a risk judgment, you are essentially doing an evaluation of probabilities and saying, we're going to roll the dice because we think the probabilities warrant this particular position. Sometimes the dice come up badly, and you can have negative outcomes even if you've done everything correctly.
And conversely, you can have a poor process, but everything comes up smelling roses.
Exactly. And sadly, that happens more than perhaps we like to admit.
Yes. So you can't always go by the outcome of a particular decision. And in fact, that's something we emphasize early on in the course and refer to it specifically as outcome bias. The fact that, and I'll just go back to something I heard many, many years ago from a senior manager, which is, oh, I'm an outcome oriented guy. No kidding. It
If you're
is human
not, you really
nature.
don't belong in business.
All right. What are you doing here if you don't care about the outcome? That is human nature in general. We all want the outcome. We all want to look at the final score, whatever it is, whether it's a sporting event or a balance sheet, in terms of evaluating whether something worked or not. That is just the way we're wired. It doesn't take away from the fact that in order to best optimize the chance of having the desired outcome, that certain things should be in place in terms of getting to a particular decision point.
So let me then extend that because I think these are all really important considerations to keep in mind that no single outcome, that no single choice is descriptive or diagnostic of the process itself, whether that process be ERM protocols within an organization, the choice architecture an individual employs, or where they tend to fall on the antisocial personality disorder spectrum. Assessing any of these requires looking at a sequence or series of outcomes, a series of judgments and decisions, and looking at what are the commonalities in terms of how were they made. As we said, any outcome can break positive or negative once, but if we see over time that somebody is making risky decision after risky decision after risky decision, now we can start asking questions. Now we can say, okay, this individual seems to have a higher risk appetite than the rest of the organization. Now, again, this in and of itself does not automatically imply sociopathic tendencies. There are lots of different ways someone can land on a differential risk appetite. But we do know that individuals who score on this antisocial personality disorder spectrum have lowered impulse control. They show greater impulsivity. They show skewed intertemporal discounting. We know that everybody tends to discount future outcomes relative to present ones. Sociopaths do that to a far greater extent. And so they're very present oriented. And all of this can lead to a very skewed risk appetite. So when we see these risky judgments over and over and over again, now I think it's appropriate to start questioning what's going into them.
I think that's true. And I think going beyond just how much risk is being taken comes to the nature of the risk itself that's being taken, which gets into some of the individuals you pointed out in your introduction, John, such as Bernie Madoff, as just one example. So those who enter into certain schemes that ultimately turn out to be rather fraudulent, it's not always as if these things start off in such a massively fraudulent state. Often there's certain rules that are being bent initially or slightly broken, and then over time tend to gravitate towards something that's far more extreme. And just as one example, I remember from my training, I remember when I went to my fellowship admissions course to get my fellowship with the Society of Actuaries certification, that they showed a movie, a very old movie from the 1970s called The $1 Billion Bubble, which, and I'll try to keep it short here for our listeners, but I definitely recommend it if you want to understand how even relatively well-intended individuals who aren't necessarily sociopathic by nature can be led down a path of doing what turns out to be sociopathic things. But it's about essentially those who started off with small things that might not hit the radar, but over time, it tends to build on itself, and you wind up starting to do more and more sociopathic things to try to cover your tracks. And that's when you have to start to question yourself, what's really going on here? Why are you taking that level of risk?
Yeah, I'm trying not to go down a particular road. Listeners, there is a topic that Rich and I are preparing right now, where when it was teed up to us, we looked at this and we said, how the heck did they manage to do something so overtly duplicitous and misleading? This is not an edge case of fraud. This is overt and monstrous fraud where there's no way of painting this in a positive light or even a benign light. And when you have two or three executives or leaders who are calling the shots, it's easy to see, okay, this could happen. But then when we asked and we found out there were 51 people in this organization, I remember one of the conversations we had was, how did this then happen? How do you get 51 people fully bought into this Ponzi scheme? And You hit it right on the head there. There is a potential for contagion of sociopathic behavior through moral licensing and through normalcy bias. There's been a lot of research showing that once people stretch their own personal limits of what they consider to be acceptable behavior, once they violate their own standards, even a little bit just once, it's much easier than subsequently to do it again, and from there to do it again. And in relatively short order, you have people who genuinely consider themselves to be upstanding individuals who are performing all manner of illegal or unethical activity. This also then facilitates normalcy bias, the sense of this is what's all around me all the time, therefore, this is normal. There's nothing atypical or unusual about what is being done here. And so, yes, you can absolutely get an organization-wide manifestation of antisocial behavior, even though most of the individuals undertaking it themselves are not in any way neurodivergent.
Yeah, and I'll just follow up on that with you can see social proof and conflict aversion come through in those kinds of organizations where normalcy bias has led to, okay, this is okay. And everybody looks around and says, oh, I didn't know if this was okay, but since our this person is doing it, maybe my coworker is doing it and they're not getting flagged for it, or even worse, leaders are doing it and sanctioning it, then it must be okay. And I don't want to rock the boat because, well, I have a job and I have a family to feed. So I'm not going to get in the way here. I'm just going to follow along. So you can see how then how sociopaths can rise to a certain level and actually do a lot of damage in an organization, even staffed by many well-meaning people.
Let's be very clear what we mean when we say do a lot of damage. There is that conception that I mentioned in the introduction that people have about sociopaths, that they are these malicious serial killers or discordians at best who go around disrupting the system for its own sake. The fact that these individuals are able to rise within the organization says that they produce at least some benefit. They are able to produce something that is worthwhile or perceived to be worthwhile to the organization. They swing for the fences. And you and I know, just purely on probability, sometimes when you swing for the fences, you win. And it's not a one-to-one relationship by any means, but there is some association that the bigger the swing, the greater the potential payoff is. So if somebody has done this because they have disinhibition, because they have poor impulse control, and they've been successful, and they are charming, then yes, they can lead people. They can get buy-in to their particular approach or leadership style. And at least over some period of time, they've created benefit for the organization. The damage that they do, as I see it, and please, if you feel differently, tell me. As I see it, the damage here is in creating problematic culture, problematic protocols, problematic risk appetite for the organization itself, because at some point you're not going to get lucky anymore.
Yeah, and again, that gets to the nature of the risk exposure itself. So again, I want to be clear here that risk exposure to things such as higher interest rates, as we've talked about with Silicon Valley Bank in a prior episode, or exposure to equity markets or things like that, we can debate what the right level of exposure is. And one of the things that prospect theory teaches us is that while there are the majority of folks who are loss averse and risk averse, there are going to be people in the distribution who are risk seeking. And not all of those risk seeking people, in fact, I would say probably a good number of them, are necessarily sociopaths or exhibit some of the other behaviors, such as lack of empathy, lack of warmth, lack of caring for social values, and caring for others. So you can't necessarily look at someone's risk-based decisions themselves, particularly if it's within the framework of the business. So for example, if you are a portfolio manager or if you are running a bank and you decide to run these risks, is that necessarily an indication of sociopathic behavior by any stretch of the imagination? I would posit that other types of exposures, such as being blatantly non-compliant and blatantly loose and fast with people's money or with other assets or even their own health, those are things to me that start to cross a line where that's more of a smoking gun, that there's something going on with these individuals. That's my own personal opinion, but we can have a conversation about that.
No, I think that's absolutely fair. One of the things that I think is really interesting is when we look at the behavior of sociopaths through a behavioral economic lens, not just the clinical lens, but looking at how they differ from neurotypical individuals on conventional economic decision making and behavioral economic decision making, is some of the breakdowns that they display in what we would consider typical mental accounting. We've talked about how, I believe we've talked about, although perhaps we haven't yet. If not, we definitely deserve an episode towards this. We may or may not have talked about how individuals tend to allocate resources to particular categories, to particular buckets, that you have your normal income, that you have windfall income, that you have your home expenses, that you have your food expenses, that you have your recreation expenses. And we track all of these different accounts mentally. This is why it's called mental accounting. Those individuals who do show particular levels of antisocial personality disorder or antisocial personality traits show a reduced categorization of accounts, or perhaps more accurately, an ability to inappropriately lump accounts together. And this can lead to a lot of illicit or inappropriate behavior. The example that was brought to mind, and I want to emphasize that this individual, to my knowledge, has never experienced a clinical diagnosis of sociopathy or antisocial personality disorder. But when we look at the behavior, it is in line with what we're discussing right now, is Elizabeth Holmes at Theranos, where company money was used for her own home, for her own travel expenses, for a really lavish lifestyle. You can say, oh, this person was just evil and malevolent, and maybe so, but it's also a bit of a, if this individual truly is sociopathic or has sociopathic traits, it really could just be a breakdown in mental accounting, that in her mind, this money was hers. This money was part of her own personal account. And yeah, I can see in those cases how you do get organizational damage from maybe not well-intentioned, but from not intentionally malicious behavior.
I think that's a great example. The Theranos, the Elizabeth Holmes example is right on point. It also relates to a previous episode that we've recorded on FTX,
Yeah.
that Sam Bankman-Friedman in that case. Another example related to this type of thing with mental accounting is Bernie Madoff, in that he found it perfectly okay for an extended period of time, we're talking decades, of taking customer funds to pay excess promised returns to keep the game going. He was perfectly fine raising more money, continually raising money to be able to pay others to keep his ongoing Ponzi scheme going. And somehow never really felt any sense of remorse about it. And I don't think it really hit him, from what I've read anyway, until he disclosed all of this to his sons, who I, from everything I've read, they must have been in absolute shock. And they really, at that point, didn't want to have anything more to do with him, which is a sad story in and of itself.
And that's classic sociopathic behavior right there. That is the complete inability to recognize other humans as human. In Madoff's mind, he wasn't really doing anything wrong because people were cattle to him. And there's an element of mental accounting to that, yes, but I think that speaks more to that utter lack of empathy and conscience, that sense that or lack of sense that what I'm doing, what I am performing has consequences beyond myself.
Yeah, so getting into the whole thing of fungibility, and let's be clear with our listeners, because again, I don't think we've done this episode yet. So we will be talking about the concept of fungibility. There is a time and a place for it. And we'll get into more of that. It's definitely not within the scope of this particular podcast. However, when fungibility is used to clearly perpetuate a fraud, then there's deeper issues. There's things going on that go well beyond just certain behavioral aspects that are common from person to person.
Yeah, that lack of framework leads to all manner of challenges. And when I say lack of framework, I mean lack of foundational premises or principles as to is this appropriate behavior or not? There's a really interesting article. I first read this, I want to say back in 2013. There was an article in Psychology Today called Confessions of a Sociopath. And the pen name of the author, M.E. Thomas, she's gone on to write a number of pieces. I believe she wrote a book as well. Interestingly enough, she was what you would characterize as a high functioning sociopath, law professor, led Bible study in her church. She mentioned that she was raised in the Church of Latter-day Saints, and despite knowing fully that she was a sociopath and she didn't care about other people, the Church of Latter-day Saints actually provided a very useful framework for her, and she could employ that in her day-to-day life to figure out what can I do and what can I not do to raise eyebrows and raise suspicion. So this foundational tool, this foundational framework was how she went about navigating the world. And in cases like Bernie Madoff, I feel as though those frameworks just don't exist. The framework is hedonism, pleasure principle, self-indulgence. What do I want to do right now, here in this moment?
Yeah, exactly. And one other thing before we leave mental accounting completely, and again, we will talk about this further in the future podcast. So stay tuned, listeners. We have a lot more to say about it. But I want to talk a little bit about reciprocity, which, as you and I have talked about, and we go to great lengths in our textbook to talk about the importance of reciprocity, and that it's a very natural human part of our evolution. And it's how we deal with each other socially. It's how we build bonds with each other and build relationships. Is through this idea of I get something from you and I automatically feel I owe you something in return. And it may not be of exactly the same value. We don't necessarily put an absolute price on everything out there that we receive, but we certainly feel an obligation to try to make some form of restitution, if not today, certainly at some point in the near future. And my observation in the workplace, and again, I'm going to be very, very non-specific here, but I have worked with more than one or two individuals in my career who have certainly reached out to me and others for assistance on specific projects and seeking me out for advice, having lengthy conversations, and using what I provided. And by the way, just for everybody listening, I knew what I was doing and I was perfectly fine with providing said individual with my guidance and advice, and maybe even just some unique, maybe secrets that I had, some sort of things that I felt were like, oh, wow, this is something, should I just say this to this person? But I wanted to help. My idea was to help and then not receive anything back, even when I requested. And not that I necessarily was doing some sort of quid pro quo, but nothing even offered, sometimes not even a thank you. And that may be relatively mild. It's not necessarily an indication of full-blown sociopathy, but certainly it's an example of something that I would consider at least certainly antisocial and certainly not within the normal bounds of mores and values of social interaction.
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely. That is indicative, most likely, of if not a clear lack, at least a diminished sense of empathy and a diminished sense of social obligation, both of which are hallmarks of sociopathic behavior. So yes, and that was actually something I had written down in my notes as well in preparation for this episode, that reciprocity, notions of trust and fairness really break down entirely with such individuals. And when I say notions of trust, both your ability to trust them and their willingness or even ability to trust other people. And then, of course, if reciprocity does not exist or is compromised, then fairness and balance by extension become entirely imbalanced. And making assumptions that such an individual will behave in a fair fashion really are quite erroneous.
Okay, so John, I think one of the things I'm sure our listeners are wondering at this point is, okay, these are all great examples, and I see what you're talking about. And I'm going to guess a number of our listeners have probably experienced someone like this or some type of behavior like this in an associate or someone they know at some point in their lives or careers. So I think the logical question is, what can they do? How can they mitigate the potential risk exposure from someone like this, particularly in a business setting?
It's a really tricky question. There's a lot of delicacy around this because, as we said, sociopathy, antisocial personality disorder is a recognized clinical disorder. And so you can't fire somebody for having ASPD. You can try to distance yourself from them, but they will still exist within the organization. And if they are in a senior leadership role, they will still have the ability to exert influence on the direction of the organization. And honestly, you can get rid of people for performance. And if somebody makes enough mistakes or bad judgments or is found to have problematic interactions with people, and this would be usually where HR comes in, it is possible to remove them from an organization in that regard. But again, it's very delicate, especially if somebody is known to have a particular pathology. It's unlikely that serial killers are going to get promoted to this level within an organization, so it becomes a very delicate balancing act. Mostly what we can do in these circumstances is try to look at, when is somebody exhibiting a pattern of perhaps antisocial judgments or risk profiles that are congruent with what we would describe as sociopathic tendencies, and make sure that when judgments or decisions come down from them, they're subject to additional due diligence. This, of course, presupposes that you are in a position where you have oversight over the judgments that they provide. But as we described, very often these individuals are going to rise to leadership positions. And so it's just as likely, if not more likely, that they will sit above you within the organization. And this makes it even more delicate. So, what can one do there? Well, this is perhaps the most delicate part of what I have to describe when I relate what my company does. This is where we have to engage in leveraging bias. Yes, sociopaths have a different operating mode than most individuals, but it is no less rational or no less predictable than that of neurotypical individuals. It's a different model. It works in a different way, but unless we are looking at genuine psychosis, which is a very different thing than psychopathy and sociopathy, they are going to behave in a reliable and predictable way. And in this case, what you provide to that individual in terms of inputs, in terms of information, framing of information, characterization of options and data, can be put forward in such a way that you have some capacity to influence the judgments and decisions that they make. Now, this is not necessarily the cleanest approach, and it's maybe not as robust as one might hope, but it is the one that is least likely to get you as an individual in trouble and reduces your own personal exposure.
I would agree with that, John. I think it's important to understand what the individual involved, particularly if they are high up in an organization, they're making key decisions, what matters to them. And that the way that information is presented, particularly risk information, is presented in a way that connects with their own values and what they are trying to achieve. Because again, going back to what we've stated at the beginning of this podcast, most of these folks are high functioning individuals. They are highly successful. And not only are they necessarily charming and persuasive in many cases, but they're also highly talented and highly intelligent. And they're often very clear about the things that matter to them. So when you're dealing with them, you need to make sure that you're communicating in a language that will resonate with them. And that probably gives you the best chance to influence them in some way to maybe soften some of their risk-taking positions.
That is a fantastic point. We talk a lot about self-interest bias on this podcast and how self-interest is a potent driver of behavior in all people. But in people who are strong on the sociopathic trait scale or spectrum, self-interest is everything. Self-interest is the sole consideration that they have in their decision making. And presenting things in such a way and working towards their own self-interest, aligning your own position and the best interest of the company to the extent that you can with their own self-interest is probably going to make for the smoothest ride that you could possibly experience.
Yes, I would say you actually have to make yourself an ego counterweight, meaning they're often so self-absorbed and so very much about what's in it for me that if you really want to be able to engage with them in a productive way, it's important to reduce one's own ego. And we all have that. And I'm not saying go meditate in a cave for 2 weeks and come out and everything is light and love. I'm just saying reduce one's own need for recognition and being valued and having to be in the spotlight. That can be challenging. And I'm not suggesting this is an easy approach, but it is one that I have found in my experience that will keep things as smooth and more importantly, as productive as possible within an organization and steering away from potential potholes. My last point on this is, again, it depends on the nature of what you're trying to do. If you do see red flags or things that are problematic and potentially, if not unethical, maybe even illegal. And I think even again, if it crosses an ethics border with you, I think then you do have a tough decision to make. And again, I don't envy you if you're in this situation. But then what you need to do is rely on others and to work with others to, in particular, your compliance folks, your legal folks, go get good advice and make sure that you're working in an organization where there are appropriate protections for whistleblowers. That will be critical in terms of your strategy for dealing with those kinds of situations. Those are separate from just what I would call within the normal bounds of risk-seeking behavior. And then finally, when you're dealing with these folks, and again, this is more about going back to the whole ego aspect of it, employ what we like to refer to as IKEA bias, or the fact that and again, for those of you not familiar with IKEA bias, IKEA has built a whole business model around getting people to at least partially build their own furniture, and that their model thesis is, gee, if you have put your own hard work into building a piece of furniture or assembling a piece of furniture, you're less likely to return it. There is something satisfying about do-it-yourself, DIY kinds of activity. And I would suggest, particularly for those who are in risk functions, that if you can work with those who exhibit some sociopathic traits and you can bring them into the risk process and give them some sense of ownership of it or some sense of contribution to it, they're more likely to feel satisfied and to feel good about what they're doing and more importantly, about what you're doing to manage risk, and therefore to help moderate the overall risk profile of the organization. So in closing, there are a couple of things. First off, expect to see this kind of behavior in your organization at some point. It doesn't necessarily mean that the people exhibiting the behavior are sociopaths or bad people in any way, shape, or form, but you should be aware that you will see it from time to time, even in some well-meaning people. Second, chances are in your career, you're going to run into these folks, and probably they're going to be in positions of significant power and influence. Third, as I hope we've given you here in these last couple of minutes, there are constructive ways to work with these people. And there are different solutions depending on the nature of the sociopathic behavior and how far it crosses over into unethical and perhaps even illegal behavior. Thank you for listening, and good luck in your journey.
Behavior and Risk is brought to you by Capita Solutions. Behavior and Risk staff includes our research team, Sherry Xu and Jin Zhang, and our editing team, Qingying Gao and Athena Liu. Theme music by Crypt of Insomnia. The opinions presented here are solely those of John Burkhart and Rich Loria and do not represent those of Columbia University, Capita Solutions, or any other organization. We thank you for taking a chance on us today.